Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are very lucky today to be joined by Professor Peter Cappelli. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Peter before we get started here. But Peter is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the prestigious Wharton School and Director of Wharton Center for Human Resources. Obviously, he specializes in human resources and management. And he is the co-author of the terrific book, In Praise of the Office, The Limits to Hybrid and Remote Work. And again, this is a topic that is certainly highly debated inside of where I work at a technology company, which again, I think you can build up strong arguments on both sides of the fence for which makes sense or which are supportable. But we're going to get into a conversation here with Peter about his book and probably the pros and cons of the different types of ways to structure the office. So, Peter, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good. Thank you. My pleasure.
So maybe just as a starting point, how did you get into researching kind of human resource management? How did you get into this to begin with?
Well, I wrote a book about this before at the very beginning of the pandemic. And the reason was we were just getting so many questions from employers and around the organizations, around us about what do we know? And it turns out, what should we be doing? It turns out that, we had actually done a fair amount of research, the academic community, not me personally, about remote work before the pandemic. And so that was why I got into this, because I've written this first book. And then the publisher came back and said, we'd like you to update it. And it seemed to me there was so much new that there was no point in updating. You might as well start over. So, and so that's, that was kind of the origins to see what do we know since the pandemic, which is really what we care about, right?
So if we go pre-pandemic, what did the research say at that point? Because I think, again, some people might be surprised to know that there was, like you're saying, like a lot of research that was done pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
What did it say pre-pandemic about remote versus, say, in the office? Where did the research lie at that point?
Yeah. So the big, there was lots of little one-off events where basically people in firms, maybe tech firms too, were trying to work for a while remotely away from the office. You saw this historically in expat assignments, where you were sent away from headquarters. And basically all that research showed that for the employee, career-wise, everything is bad. Yeah. And that won't shock you, right? I mean, if all your colleagues are in the office and you're remote, they forget about you. Problem of expats is often that, then your assignment's done, nobody remembers who you are or what you were doing. So everything was bad. Promotion rates were lower, your satisfaction was lower, your commitment to the organization was worse, your engagement was lower. I mean, you name it, everything was worse. That isn't all that surprising and doesn't say that much about the pandemic per se, the post-pandemic experience. The more recent event was during the dot-com boom in Silicon Valley, where they were so short on real estate that they were trying to get people to work from home. And there they invented lots of things that reappeared. One is hoteling. So the idea was, or hot desking, maybe is that the Canadian term for this? Is the European term, is hot desking.
Hoteling would be the Canadian term. Yeah, hoteling. Yeah.
So, and the idea was, look, only come in a couple of days a week. And then when you come in, call us, reserve an office. You can be here for 2 days a week or whatever, and then the rest of the time you're working at home. I'd say that was a disaster. People hated it. And they hated it because you wanted to be in the office to be with your coworkers. And the problem with hoteling was you never knew who you were going to sit with. And they started creating temporary spaces in other locations for people to come in, right? So you weren't keeping your own office. Now, they were doing more stuff. They would, organize your office, take everything down. The day you were going to come in, they'd put it in shopping carts. Somebody would set it up so you would feel maybe like this was a little more your office. But basically the problem was they wanted to own their own space, got harder to do, that is decorate it their own way, be familiar with their own equipment. And more importantly, they wanted to sit with their friends. And hoteling didn't allow you to do that. The other thing that started to happen was open offices, open desk plans, right? Which meant just tables. And everybody hated that too. And still hate it because there's no privacy. The idea initially, or the rationalization, was that people could talk more easily because you're all sitting around with each other. The reality was you didn't want to disturb people, so nobody talks, and no conversation's private. And if you go into one of those places, you just see everybody's plugged in on headphones, nobody's talking to anybody, and it's worse. So I'd say those were the main things that we knew going into the pandemic.
So pandemic hits, and were you surprised with the way things played out? Like if we were to talk to Peter in March of 2020, when this was really starting to take off, and they said, well, could companies pivot? And but by April, I think we were all working from home, and at least up north of the border here.
Yeah.
What surprised you the most about the pivoting? Because at that point they say, look, work from home doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden companies have to pivot on a dime to, remote work everybody. What surprised you most coming out of that situation?
Well, and I think you pointed out the important thing, and that is this experiment where everybody was working remotely had never been tried before, right? So the lessons from the past don't really apply hardly at all to the current arrangement, except for hoteling. We'll come back to that, and hot desking. So I think everybody was surprised. We had no idea whether this would work. There are some things that are important to remember about the pandemic and why it worked better than we thought it was going to. One is people were desperate to be able to keep working, because if you didn't do this, you were either going to have to go into the office and risk death. Remember, we thought
Absolutely.
that you were going to die, right?
Absolutely.
And we looked at Italy and what was happening there. It was horror stories, right? And the other alternative was you're all laid off and nobody's got a job. And for the country as a whole, and Canada too, the U.S. experience, Canadian experience, quite similar in this regard. The whole country could fall apart, right? So employers rightly told their employees, look, we got to work this out. We need your help. We're all in the same boat on this. Your bosses are remote, everybody. And people really pitched in, And I think there were lots of opportunities to cheat and goof off and stuff, but I don't think people did them. I mean, I think they really felt like we were keeping the ship afloat. That's not going to go on forever.
Well, the added thing is, you mentioned this in your book, is the fact that schools were shut down.
Yeah,
and that basically screwed everybody who had kids. You know what I mean? Like at that point, it is all hands on deck. And, you're basically trying to make do during the day at home, and then probably turning on the light at night, trying to figure something out. You know what I mean? Like that was, it was a nightmare at that point.
And I think that's a great point too, because it reminds us that employers were really just trusting everybody. You figure out how to get this done, and giving them a lot of authority over how to get things done. So, it worked way better than we thought. Partly because it wasn't just remote work. It was because we were trying to save our skins. We were trying to save our jobs. We were trying to save the countries. People really pitched in. 5 years later, that's not the case, right?
So how is the pendulum swung then? Is that the pendulum swings one way in April, June, July, go forward on in 2020? Why do you think the pendulum now is swinging the other way to say, look, we had to take it for all the reasons you just said. We had to take it too far to one extreme back in 2020. But now, 4 or 5 years later, the pendulum is sort of swung the other way, where we're bringing people back more in the office or figuring out hybrid arrangements or wherever. How can you give us some perspective on that pendulum swinging the other way?
Well, our memories are short, but you'll remember that we expected in the U.S. that everybody be back in the office by 4th of July of 2020. And then it was going to be Labor Day of 2020. And then they pushed it out. They said the new year, 2021. And the problem was we kept getting new waves of COVID, right? So it wasn't that the employers said, in April, gee, this is great. they were intending to bring everybody back,
Yep.
right? But there's one little nuance that we haven't paid enough attention to, and that is the CFOs early on, 1 month into the pandemic, said they were planning to cut office space because they're the folks that thought, gee, this is great because we could really save real estate. And that's a continuing issue within organizations, is that basically the CFOs see this as a great cost-cutting thing. The line managers are the ones who didn't like it, right? And ultimately the CEOs. So we did go through a long period, right, where people were working remotely completely. Companies were just got tired of saying, okay, by April, okay, no, by May, because it was so unpredictable. Once the vaccines rolled out, then I think companies made a mistake in that they did not articulate to employees what their preferred situation was going to be. And I think, nor did they say, we're just going to experiment and see. I know people have started to like this. But, in that first year, there was at least one survey showing that 85% of employees said they understood why we should come back to the office. Now, you wait 5 years to do it, and they don't understand that anymore, right? And people start to build their lives around being able to work remotely. I think some of that, frankly, was a huge risk, particularly those people who moved. I'm going to go to Banff, hang out
Absolutely.
there, because my employer says it's okay. But, they just couldn't shouldn't probably have relied on that, right? So why the push now? I think many organizations move to hybrid. The US, Canada, UK are the kind of outliers in that most of the other countries brought most everybody back. So we're the countries with the most remote work still. So the intermediate step was hybrid. And most of our book is really kind of about hybrid. We're not arguing that everybody has to go back to the office. What I think we are saying is, and we're trying to document, is there's a ton of evidence that goes back for a very long period of time that lots of things about office work get done because we know each other and because we're face to face. Many of us have problems with our accounting department on reimbursements, and they go on and on and on. And when they're on email, you get nastier and nastier with each other. What are you, an idiot? And then boom, 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 up they go. If the person is around the corner from you in your office, you just go around to see them. And even though you might feel like punching them, you don't. You just say, hey, just trying to figure this out here. You both get nicer. The thing gets solved right then. Right. And the ability, particularly for new hires, right, who are lost. If you go into an office that's remote, you might as well stay home, right? Because you learn the culture by watching. You learn from other people by asking them questions. If you have to schedule a Zoom meeting to ask a question from somebody because they're remote, it just doesn't happen.
Yep.
So new hires in particular are lost, and we've kind of known that for a while. So there's all kinds of things about being face-to-face, which are really useful. We started to really learn that after the remote work went on for a while, right? And people stopped, just trying to do whatever it takes to get work done. You can't sustain that forever, right? So I think that's why we're starting to see it now. The other reason, frankly, is the hybrid arrangements just were not doing what they were supposed to. And in particular, people just weren't coming to the office. So we did a focus group with a big employer around the world and, visiting their offices and talking to people who were in their remote arrangement. And their experience was pretty much like everybody else's. People who are reporting on their own hybrid experience, people don't come in. So, you got a 2-day or 3-day a week, 2-day a week hybrid. You would expect on average 20% of the employees would be in there, maybe. And it turns out nobody's there, right? And we get coffee badging. You make me come in. I come in, wipe my badge, get coffee, I go home, right? So hybrid wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. And I think employers started to get irritated with employees about that, rightly, But on the other hand, the employees are looking to the organization to figure out, what am I supposed to be doing? Because we all know we have rules and we have rules, right?
Yep.
Things
Yep.
get violated all the time and nobody pays much attention to. And we're always kind of testing those, and if there's no resistance, and one of the things that happened is with, anchor days, employees don't come in, nobody does anything. So then I come in, nobody's there. Why should I come in? Or nobody comes in, right? So there are lots of things that just weren't working well. I think eventually they kind of got fed up. The economy was no longer quite the seller's market for employees that it was.
Yep.
So that what they were hearing from HR is people are going to quit if we try to rein this in. They started to believe, no, they're not. And they're probably right. So I think that's why it started to happen now.
Got it. So you mentioned the CFOs. Now I'm a finance guy as well, full disclosure. And I certainly appreciate your point, because when it talks about trying to measure, the benefits of in office, on one side, you'd say, well, there's a cost of that office, and it's very easy to quantify that cost.
Right.
You take the rent, you add the, electricity and the water, blah, blah, blah. And you have a number. Now, so when you give up that office, you know exactly how much you're saving. Now, on the flip side, if you give up that office, there's a number of drawbacks. Unfortunately, I would say those are not as easy to measure.
Yep.
The impact of those, and maybe just give us some perspective, Peter, on trying to balance those. Some tips from your side on how do you measure those? Again, we know how to do the rent. That one's easy, simple math. How do we do the other side of it, the softer side of trying to of not meeting face to face?
Yes. Scott, you put your finger on exactly not only this problem, but the broader problem of managing organizations, right? And that is, you can easily see the costs of these things. You can't easily see the benefits. And just to go a little deeper, something that I worked on is financial accounting, stacks the deck against employees because, employees can't be assets, right? So even though we say people are our most important asset, no, they're not. A financial accounting, employees can't be assets. You have to own something for it to be an asset. You can't invest in something unless it's an asset. Training can't be an investment because people, you don't own them. And so, so that is the problem.
It's great. And just like, you're totally right, because you take the Wharton School of Business where you teach.
Yeah.
The value of the Wharton School of Business is not the concrete walls. It's not the classroom. It's not the tech. It is the people. It is the teachers. It is the experience you bring. And if you were to look at the Wharton School of Business, if you were to pull their financials and look on the balance sheet, the value of the asset is nowhere to be found.
Well, and it's true for professional sports teams, right?
Absolutely.
Financial accountants look at that and say, sorry, you don't own these people. They're really valuable. People come to watch them play. They're under contract. Yeah, you don't own them though, sir. Right. So how do you figure this stuff out? Well, there have been a bunch of new studies being done since the pandemic, looking at various aspects of performance, and most of them show problems. Now, the difficulty is we tend to focus on jobs where you can easily measure their performance, and those tend to be individual contributor jobs. And those are exactly the ones where you would think this doesn't matter so much. Outside salespeople, they never had to be in the office. In fact, you didn't want them really to be in the office, right? So, if they're remote, probably doesn't matter that much. A lot of tech jobs, at least some parts of them anyway, in certain programming tasks, you don't have to be next to the people you're working with to get things done. So the deck is stacked against not finding effects, but nevertheless, they do find negative effects, right? And I think employers can just see them, with new hires. So one of the things I heard from these folks in focus groups was they figured the new hires took about 3 months longer to figure out what's going on. Okay, 3 months. Typical organization, 10% turnover. Every year, 10% of your employees are lost for an additional 3 months. What's that cost you, right? So,
that's huge.
That's
a massive number.
Yeah, they don't give huge numbers on these things, right? That's the problem. It's hard to see the effects. But when we measure them, in the few cases we have, you can see them. And I think, the line managers do have a sense this stuff really starts to cost you, right? In terms of learning, in terms of innovation in particular, that's what I hear from people. How long does it take to get problems solved? It takes longer. The big thing I can see, which drives me nuts, is meeting time is way up. And useless meeting time is way, way, way up, right? So if you think you got an 8-hour day, meeting time is up by about an hour by most measures. for remote workers, an additional hour, and the meetings are far less useful. Why is that? They're bigger because it's easy just to add somebody. Hey, Scott, add me to that meeting. I want to be in that. But then we have a cameras off norm, which means people are on the meeting, but they're not paying any attention. And now we're finding that they're not even there. They send their agent, the little AI agent, to take notes at the meeting. They're not even there. We got 100 people online. Nobody knows what's going on in the meeting.
Wow.
Nobody's commenting. Afterwards, we have to have post-meeting meetings because nobody was paying attention, of course, during the meeting. Now they got objections to what we concluded. And now we have to have post-meeting meetings to work that stuff out. So, there are lots of, not lots, but there are examples like that where anybody can see what the problem is, right? And how it hurts the organization, right?
To me, the most interesting chapter of your book was the discussion on meeting time, because like when you first saw the data, Peter, is that a virtual meeting takes significantly longer than an in-person meeting. Were you surprised at that point? Like I certainly was surprised when I first saw that. But when you go through the data and actually start rhyming off all the reasons like you just did, it makes complete sense as to why a virtual meeting takes actually a lot longer than an in-person meeting.
Well, I think this is where we had research already, just in a different sphere. It wasn't in management, it was in computer science, about virtual communication, virtual interaction. It doesn't work as well as face-to-face. Not a big surprise, right? You can just learn more from people. And the fact that we can see people was such a step up from just being on the phone with them. But nevertheless, it's a big difference compared to face-to-face. And here's an example that I never thought of until talking to these focus groups people. If you're running the meeting and it's face-to-face, first, your meeting's going to be smaller because the room only holds 5 people or something like that. So we just can't let everybody in. And second, you can tell when you're losing the audience.
Yeah.
And you better say, well, it looks like you don't understand this, right? On a 100-person call, nobody's going to raise their hand when cameras are off anyway and say, excuse me, I personally don't know what's going on here, right? So, we kind of knew this already from this other world of communication studies, but we never did it at scale the way we end up doing remote work, right? Now we can see all this stuff at scale. My sense about this, why it's interesting academically, is that we studied office work, but only in an office context. And the ways in which we found it working, succeeding, was that due to the nature of office work per se, or was it due to the fact that we were all in person? So if you try to do office work not in person, you could separate those out. And what we see is there are real differences, and it's mainly worse when you are remote. Right?
And in your world at Wharton School, do you guys still have virtual classrooms? So is all the learning now in person? Like when you lecture, when you talk to the students, is it like basically nearly 100% in person? Because if you try and do this virtually, they're going to be cruising the internet doing something else.
Yeah. I mean, they kind of do that anyway, even if they just do it hiding. But in person, it's harder to do. No, we learned that pretty early on, that you would just have to have them there. In fact, there's a reason why distance learning did not work. So you may remember a few years ago, we thought, college is going to be obsolete because we could put all our material online. And, Stanford had this online computer series. And I remember 1 million people signed up for this Stanford course online. And I think 2 people finished it, I think that was the thing. It turns out that our secret sauce is that if people are in person, they feel pressure to do the work. And some of it is they don't want to look stupid in front of their peers. They don't want to look stupid sometimes in front of us. And if you're remote, and especially your camera's off, nobody knows if you haven't done anything. And so you're not engaged, right? So, we've known that for a long time.
Yeah, as was told to me by one of our senior folks around here when we were talking about the benefits of in-person meeting, he boiled it down quite simply to say, nothing beats the old-fashioned whiteboard. And I'm sure you're in the same boat. I'm gonna say chalkboard. I'm sure you're not using a chalkboard, but you're probably using something similar to that. In that, nothing could beat that, no matter how good some of these virtual tools are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And even our neuroscience colleagues are telling us now that, they can see in brain imaging the differences when people are face to face as opposed to when they
Really?
are, in some kind of remote context. So yeah, no, it's a big difference, right?
The other thing that I found really interesting in your book is the amount of data that exists that people might not realize with respect to meeting times is that you can actually figure a lot of this stuff out.
Yeah.
Maybe just comment a little bit about that, Peter, is that,
Yep.
when looking at the benefits of working from home versus in the office, there's a lot of data that exists out there. I remember, I think this might have been pre-COVID, but there was a story, I think it was the Yahoo CEO
Yeah.
who, everybody was working virtually and she decided to pull the VPN logins and she realized that no one was actually logging in.
Mm, mm,
And that
mm.
ended the virtual. That might have been pre-COVID,
Yep.
but and that was the end of the virtual working arrangements
Yeah.
when they realized that nobody was actually leveraging the VPN to log into the system.
Yep. Yep.
Um, but maybe just give some perspective on the data that's out there, where people can actually do a lot of the heavy lifting themselves on trying to analyze the pros and cons of remote versus in office.
Yeah, and the Yahoo story, the other interesting thing about that is she realized that the culture of the place had kind of just evaporated. And one of the reasons for bringing everybody back was to try to recreate a culture. You learn the culture by observing. And if you can't observe, you don't pick anything up, right? So, if you think about your own IT departments, and you folks are deep into this, could tell me more than I know about it, but you can pretty quickly see how much meeting time is being scheduled, how many people are in a typical meeting. That's pretty easy to see. You can look to see if you're on Teams or something, whether how many pings people are sending to each other or look at the Slack channels, and see,
Yep.
are people talking to each other? When they ping, do they get responses? How long does it take to get a response from somebody? How much time are people, posting that they're unavailable? And many places allow people to do that. Maybe it's perfectly fine. But if people are unavailable most of the time, then it's really hard to get answers and everything slows down,
Yep.
So, one of the things I think we said, just run this little experiment, just ping some people and ask them a question and see how many people reply and see how long it takes to get a reply to some of these things. So one of the things that struck me in these focus groups was that new hires said, at least some of them, that they didn't get replies to their pings, but we reply to the people that we know.
Yep.
And one of the problems is we are kind of running down that stock of social capital. So, we knew each other in the office, we go remote, we still help each other and things. But what happens if you're on one team and I'm on the other team? I need something from your team. I call you. And then in my group, they'll say, we need this. Will you call Scott? Okay. But then I leave. What does my team do? Well, now they're lost, right?
Yep.
And pretty soon, with 10% turnover or so, in 4 years, you've got half the people are new with compounding, right? So half the people are new and all those relationships get broken. And I don't answer pings, what I heard from people. The other big thing about remote work, I think, is that it's focused us much more on our own individual KPIs, that's what they're measuring. And lots of other things we just did because we were supposed to, like somebody new comes into the office. Do we take them out to lunch? Do we show them what's going on? And now you were telling me these are my KPIs. The other things I did simply because I could see it has to be done. I don't see that now, so I don't do it, right? And if somebody pings me to ask a question, I might get back to them, but I do all my own work first, right? And then I get back to them after that. And sometimes my own work may take a day or two, and they really need an answer, but they don't get it, So there's a lot more of that stuff going on, which we don't easily see. But if you wanted to, you could find it out,
Yep. So a hybrid arrangement might be considered is when you read your book, because the one thing, like you say about your book, you're not necessarily promoting one versus the other. In fact, you have discussion in there saying depending on your industry type or the type of job you do, it is not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
It is, like you said, individual contributor that might be fully remote. That might be the best way to go.
Yep.
With technology companies, though, it would seem to be like hybrid might be the best the best scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, I don't want to pretend this is one size fits all. It's not. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, Peter, what are some of the benefits of a hybrid situation, and how do you effectively put in place a hybrid situation, especially if you're in a situation right now where you're 100% remote and you basically have to convince people to come back to the office.
Yeah, I at least in the States, there's very few places that are 100% remote anymore. And sometimes they publish lists of those companies. I'm sure they're not complete, but they're almost all companies that always were remote. You know, they
Yeah.
began maybe
Even pre-hybrid or pre-COVID,
pre-
pre-COVID.
right.
Yeah.
And the other thing about those companies it's worth taking a look at, like GitHub, they're very nice about showing you everything they do, right? They've got a lot of rules. They got a PowerPoint deck of about 100 slides, 150 slides. This is what you have to do to work here. And
Wow.
a lot of it is just a lot more management stuff about transparency in particular. So, if you're in the office, you know a lot of things. If you're remote, you don't know so much informally. So everything's got to be transparent. Everything's got to be on shared drives, just a lot more work than you think. And we didn't do any of that, right? We just said, okay, go remote. And we're just going to assume
Yep.
it's like in the office. So back to your question about hybrid, there's not a ton that I can see of benefits for the organization to be hybrid. It's benefits to employees. And that's important, particularly, I think, in the US, even more than in Canada, unfortunately for us. We've just been beating our employees up more and more and more, right? Stress is up. Efforts to do more with less, which just means more work for people, are going up and up. Mental health problems are increasing here. And people say, I understand why, more time working remotely helps us, particularly families, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So that's the benefits are almost all on that side. And I think our sense was that you could get a lot of the benefits of in-person without necessarily having to be there 5 days a week. In fact, if you really managed it well, you could probably do more benefits than 4 days a week in the office and not doing anything, and maybe even 3 days a week and not doing anything. And what does that mean? That means you have to manage to create connections. And that means you got to get people together. And that means, for example, if we're going to have meetings, we have to be in person. We need people to be there on the days we're having important meetings. Just these people, we got to be there. Excuse me, it's got to be face to face. We have to find ways, for example, for my team to meet your team. And by the way, this is a broader problem with distributed teams, right? The big lesson with distributed teams is, can you get people together so that they know each other? And then you distribute them and it's not so bad. But companies that really tried to make this work are getting people together often so that they know each other and they feel a connection with each other. And some of this affects other things like turnover. It's easy to quit an organization if you don't know anybody there. It's harder if you've got friends there. We've known that
Yep.
time. So could you do things that would get people together? For example, purposefully. We'd say, for example, I have a team, Scott has a team. We're going to get together in 2 weeks on a anchor day, Thursday. We're going to have lunch, the two teams. And we're not going to do this like a social group, because social meetings, your team hangs out with your team, my team saying, that doesn't happen. So we say, we just have assigned seats. And we say, we want you guys to talk about this work issue. Talk about anything else you want, but talk about this one. And it might be, what does your team need from us? How do we interact with each other, right? You'll find all kinds of really good things come out of that. It doesn't take very long. And then I know you, and I call you afterwards if I need something. We don't have to do a lot of that stuff to get real benefits from it. So far, we've done nothing. We haven't even enforced anchor days. We haven't enforced attendance. And it's not surprising this doesn't work, right? So you could get a lot of the benefits and be hybrid, but you're going to run into problems. And the problems are going to be like this. Okay, we need everybody in the office, but on anchor days, but we cut our office space. So we can't physically get everybody in.
Yep.
Okay, so that means we're really going to have to be purposeful as to who comes in when, so we can make sure everybody overlaps at some point so people know each other. Okay. Uh, okay. But then, okay, our anchor day is Thursday, but I go to Scott and say, Scott, you know, my kids have a play date on Thursday, and it would really be hard for me to come in. Could I come in on Friday? And what do you say? Well, everybody else lets their teams come in when they want, and I don't want to be the bad guy. So this has happened in lots of places, right? You just delegate the authority, local level. They make their own little decisions. And what happens is nobody is in together, or the right people are never in together. And you always end up in the office doing Zoom calls with people who are not in the office, right, on your team.
Yep.
So somebody has to say, no, this is a priority, right? And that is a very difficult thing to make a local supervisor do on their own, right? So
So
somebody,
this process of enforcing anchor days, like enforcing anchor days and saying, look, like Tuesdays and Thursdays you're in. I don't care. Like unless you have like a medical appointment or something where again, like or you're sick or something, but
right.
you're in on those days no
Yep.
matter what. You'd say that's a critical part of the hybrid arrangement?
Yeah, I'm afraid it is. And, you know, if we're going to allow uh, people to be away for something, the meetings are still in the office and you're Zooming in. We're not
Yeah.
all Zooming. We're not making the whole meeting a Zoom meeting just because you can't be here, right? Or three people can't be here. Meeting is here. We'll Zoom you in if you want, but we're going ahead with the meeting. And everybody knows the most important 5 minutes of a meeting are when the meeting is over and people are walking away and they're talking about what the heck was this really about? You know, those are the important things, and you miss those
Yeah.
if you're not in the office, right?
And in terms of convincing people to come back to the office, I think that was another really good part of your book because there's a lot of different approaches. There's the approach of you must come back or you're fired,
Yeah.
which we've seen, some prominent CEOs use.
Yeah.
And the other probably bad way is to force everybody, tell everybody to come back and not really give them any reason, not telling
Yeah.
them why.
Exactly.
Give us some perspective, Peter, on the proper way to bring people back to the office and almost convincing them that it's the right thing to do.
Well, I think you put your finger right on it. I think the issue is that this is an enormous change for people, right? If we've gone 5 years and told them effectively or nothing that, this is okay to be remote, and now we're telling you it's not, it's a big change. So pick up any book about change management. They almost all say exactly the same thing, right? And they begin by saying, you need to have a compelling reason for the change. And the compelling reason can't be something facile like we find we just work better together. It needs to be something like we looked at what's happening with meeting time. We looked at what's happening with innovation. We looked at what's happening getting back to each other. We look at new hires who are lost, go down the list, bang, 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 bang. These are big problems. And you got to start with that. And I'm stunned when I see organizations that don't do that. It's not that hard to do, but you got to do that. And then you have to think about, okay, what are the problems in overcoming people's resistance to coming back? Well, what could you do to help with some of those things? Well, doing it gradually probably helps, particularly people who have to rearrange their family lives to make this thing work. Okay, we're going to do it gradually. We're going to give you maybe some support on that. We're going to need daycare support. Okay, at the very least, let's help you find where the daycare places are if you haven't done that already. Could we do things about commuting and things like that, and maybe some of the initial costs in coming back because you got used to not paying those?
Yeah.
There are all kinds of things that we could do. Some of it is technology, but one of the big ones is going to be, we want you to come back to the office, but we're not saying is your office is gone.
Yeah.
So we want you to come back to the office, but what you're really coming back to is a crappy open office plan where you're going to be sitting next to random people all the time, and it's not going to work very well, right? So people hate open offices. They hate hoteling. And you've cut their office space. So how are you going to make that work? I don't know. You want them to come back to the office, but you're heaping more problems on them. Why don't you come back, and it's going to be a lot worse. You okay with that? You got to.
Is there an onus? Now you've touched on this. I had the opportunity to go into Google's office here up in Toronto,
Mhm.
and it is amazing.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
hands down the best office I've ever been to. They've got, full basically restaurant style kitchens
Yep.
and places to eat and massage rooms and exercise rooms and they had a golf simulator.
Mhm.
And it's amazing of how they how they treat their employees. Now, I'm sure on the flip side is Google saying you got to be in the office 5 days a week. You know what I mean? We're going to do this.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, what you see, Peter. Obviously, there's not many companies that are going to be able to go and put in the resources that Google has put in. And this is just their Toronto office. This isn't even their office down in the valley.
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
love to see
Yes.
that office.
Yeah.
But is there an onus now on the companies to step up their game and say, hey, look, like before this was just like four walls and a doorway and a washroom. Now, we look, we're going to bring people back. We need to invest a little bit here. And I don't know what that is, but, go take a look at Google and just take a look at what they've done. Where are you on that spectrum?
Well, I think that is a great eye opener, because I think the problems, at least in the States right now, is that um, the assumption is you can just do everything and not spend any money.
Yeah.
Okay, we want to get the real estate savings from not having an office, but we want everybody to come back to the office. Please go do that, CEO. I mean, what do you want? Pick your poison, as it were, right? So you have to do something about that. And, if you're going to have hoteling, for God's sakes, don't do open office plans. We know people hate those. The cubicles are way better. They want some protection. Just wait till the next flu epidemic happens and see how people like open office plans with no partitions between each other, So
So just on that one point, Peter, I want to ask you about that. So the preferred approach is not necessarily everybody getting their own office. It's just getting their own space. They don't like hoteling because they can't get anything that is their own per se. The same thing with open office is that if you're just going to come in, but you're saying the sweet spot is to give everybody their own cubicle. It gives them a chance to personalize the space, to maybe put up a picture or two of their family, whatever it may be. Is that kind of from the employee's perspective? Is that kind of what the preferred approach is?
Well, I guess I haven't thought about that. And, preferred means carries some normative baggage here. But I would say if you think the choices are open office plans and bringing people back into existing offices, bringing back to existing offices is way better for the employees. Could be better for performance. But if your CFO says we're not doing that, then what's in between? Cubicles are better than an open office, and and better than hoteling, right?
Yeah.
Hoteling and open offices are like the worst of all possible worlds. I mean, people don't want to come back to that, and it's hard to blame them. And some of it is human nature in weird ways. For example, I never noticed my own messy office, but if I had to walk into somebody else's messy office and take that for a day, I would find everything
100%.
creepy and dirty and all that stuff, right? That keyboard is filthy. My keyboard is always filthy, but it's my filth,
Exactly.
So hoteling is, I mean, we've run these experiments. We know people hate them, right? So if you're going to say, all right, you got to come back, and it's going to be hoteling, and it's going to be open office, desks, you're just asking an awful lot of people. And, generally people say they're going to quit and don't quit.
Yeah.
So I think the evidence I looked at once, about 8% of people who say they're going to quit. And if we are going into a recession, people are going to suck up all kinds of things. But as soon as they can, if anybody else will offer them a real desk or working from home, I would leave, So particularly, the problem we want to think about is, okay, we're going to move toward hybrid, and we're going to move to coming back in 2 days a week, open office, hoteling. What that means is my real work is going to be done at home. I'm going to be performative when I come into the office. Maybe I just come in, I go to meetings, that sort of stuff. I don't want to sit at this table and other sorts of things. So my focus is going to be when I'm at home. And when people ask me questions and stuff in face-to-face, I'm going to say, let me get back to my office at home and I'll answer them there. We've made it so much easier. If you make it so much easier to do work at home than in the office, that's where they're going to go.
Yeah. And what is the corporate perspective now in 2025? You touched on this a bit earlier, but is the corporate perspective in the US largely, look, 9 times out of 10, if you're applying for a job, it's going to be probably 4 to 5 days in the office, do you think? Like, is that kind of where, as the
Where
pendulum
we are,
swung back
yeah.
to pre-COVID?
It's a little hard to know. I think one thing that surprises people about the U.S. is that we talk about remote work. It's really hybrid. It's not, almost nobody is completely remote out of the whole population. There are lots of small companies that are permanently remote, but they're small, right? So we're talking about hybrid. And hybrid is a big city, big company phenomena. So there's a study which is mind-blowing to lots of people. It was done in 2022 U.S. Census, about as good as we're going to get for data. That you would have thought would be the peak of kind of remote work, compared to now anyway. And 76% of employers said they had no remote workers of any kind, no hybrid, no nothing.
Wow.
76%. Now,
Wow.
the caveat to that is most employers are small, right? So, it's not that everybody is hybrid. It's that big city, big company employers tend to be hybrid. But is the push to come back to the office? Yeah, I'd say the big push is better attendance, right? I think most everybody is getting really quite serious about that. So they're not changing the rule. So if you looked at the rule, you wouldn't see much that's different. If you look at the reality, you'd start to see things look quite different. But for sure, nobody's been moving in the opposite direction. Nobody said, we're at 4 days remote, or 4 days in the office. Let's move to 3. Nobody's saying that. For sure, nobody's saying, let's move from hybrid to permanently remote. Unless you're a really tiny organization, I haven't heard that anyplace.
And what about from the employee's perspective? If you're trying to hire the best and the brightest of the talent,
Yeah.
What do you think that employee's expectations? Because the reality is there's drawbacks to the employee. They might look at a fully remote job and say, like all the issues you just said, Peter, but I know the issue of onboarding is a problem. And there's also isolation and things like that too, right? And corporate culture and everything. For the typical employee that's out there, what do you think their expectation is? Is their expectation maybe hybrid would be the best, or their expectation now is what you're saying is that, I'm probably going to expect to go in 5 days a week?
Well, what do they want? First question. And I think, there are individual contributor roles, certain professional services, for example, where being permanently remote is not so damaging. I think, and if you want to hire the quote stars in that role, first of all, they matter because it's individual contributions. But if you're doing work that involves interaction, involves innovation, things like that, and your choice is a star individual contributor, a star who wants to be remote, or somebody who's not quite a star who wants to be in person, maybe you're smarter to have a team of people who are pretty good, but not superstars in person, because their ability to innovate and to think creatively beats stars who are by themselves, who are not interacting with anybody, right? What's the goal you want? So I think, employees, everybody prefers choice, right? There's nobody's going to argue against that. And if you've got remote days, right, anchor days in your hybrid, you can always come in more days. Nobody prohibits you from coming in more days, right? So everybody, I think, prefers hybrid. Why would you not, right? The problem for the organization, though, is what price do you want to pay for that? What do employees think now? I think right now in the U.S., hiring is sort of just completely locked up. We're not getting quite the reality of it, but I think what's going on is businesses don't know where the economy is going. They don't know where trade is going, so they're just sitting on their hands.
Yeah, well, Amazon, 14,000 people they lay off. Like you read headlines like that, like, man, that is a lot of people, and those are scary, scary headlines that, certainly put, put fear in everybody, I would think. Like if, this is a highly, highly successful company and 14,000 people are laying, that is a lot of people.
Yeah. And what happens is the board of directors of other companies say they're able to cut people. Why aren't we? And then the pressure's on you, and then the investors are leaning on you. So you can cause a downturn in employment with a few prominent stories like that. And, much the same thing happened with remote work, right?
Yeah.
So when Amazon announced they were bringing everybody back, all around the country, boards were asking the same question: why aren't we doing this? And some of the pullback we're seeing is driven by those prominent stories, right?
Absolutely. Well, Elon Musk would have been front page. He was extremely vocal about his views on remote work, and that's another one where, again, what Elon says, again, a lot of people would certainly be paying attention to his perspectives on this sort of stuff.
Yep. Yep.
So if Peter Cappelli was starting his own business, let's say you left the Wharton school, you start your own business of 20 to 30 people. Where do you land? Let's say it's a tech company you've come up, or a consulting company, or whatever it may be. Where are you on the spectrum, Peter, in your own personal view? Which one would you land at?
Well, I think, right, if you're starting a company, there are, your circumstances are unique, right? Because you're squeezed for money. And being remote is maybe a perfectly sensible thing to do. The other thing we forget about startup companies is their networks for hiring are not very good.
Yeah.
And they don't have a lot of money. So, giving people lower pay so they can work remotely and get better people make perfect sense getting started. So, perfectly understandable. The issue is more once you get going and once you've got an organization where you've got enough resources that you could bring people together and you could have an office. I think, could you be remote and bring people together a lot? You could. And I think one of the things we have not seen, but employees actually are asking about that all over the place with remote and hybrid. Could we have more offsites to get people together?
Yep.
And they like those things, and not surprisingly, because they're primarily about building relationships, right? Now, the line managers don't like them so much because they don't see they got work they got to get done, and work stops when you're at the offsites. But, some opportunity for people to build those relationships quickly if you're starting a company makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. And, again, you go back to your CFO, the CFO starts seeing the cost of some of these offsites, and the cost of these offsites have skyrocketed post-COVID.
Yep.
You might have thought that some of this stuff would go down in price, as maybe less people are doing it, but it just seems to be the opposite.
Yep.
Is that the price of, hotels and food and all the things necessary in order to bring them all together has certainly gone up significantly.
Yeah, it's a little puzzling why, but there we are. So you could do effectively offsite at your office. We're going to take the afternoon and we got some events here and some breakout groups and discussion and stuff like that. So, I think more important than being at a resort, certainly for the organization, is can we find ways to really engage our people that will build relationships with them, right?
Last question for you, Peter, is what's next in the pipeline? Is it another book on of in office versus remote in a couple of years? Is it maybe something AI driven? What's sort of the next cutting edge thing from a human resources perspective?
Well, I have a short attention span, so we actually have been writing about AI stuff for a while, since 2018 or so, when data science stuff was starting. And we are trying to follow it. Particularly, I'm trying to get the reality, right? As opposed to the hype, because of course with AI, the hype is, right? And even if you look at Amazon's layoffs, which are driven by AI, and you read carefully, what they say is AI will replace this work. They haven't said it has replaced it. So just trying to find examples where companies have actually introduced AI and are not just talking about it and not just claiming it. And as far as we can tell, the reality is way, 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 way smaller than the rhetoric about what's going on. So I'm trying to look into companies that are actually doing stuff. What have they done? What happens when they do it? So far, the story is, it doesn't cut headcount, not initially. And it seems to improve productivity as business grows down the line, but it's a ton of work to introduce it to. So that's where I'm spending most of my time right now.
Well, I completely agree with everything you just said, is that there's a lot of hype, but when you actually go down and get into the weeds of all of it, trying to measure the benefits and identify real life examples. And as it was told to me recently by someone as well, is that, AI would seem to replace this junior analyst type of role. That junior analyst then evolves into a senior analyst, into
Right.
a manager. If you take
Right.
out all of your junior analysts, what's
Right.
your company going to look like in 10
Right.
years? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you can't just, the math or the equation doesn't work that simply.
Yeah. Just
So
find something else for them to do. That's all.
yeah.
They can't just do PowerPoint decks anymore. Right. Yep.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for joining us today. I would highly encourage people to take a read of the book, because I'm sure where most of the people work, this is a debatable topic. And you'll find in Peter's book that he goes through it and provides or compares it to a lot of science and metrics and things along those lines. And again, it's not just all about in the office; it's about looking at each one and seeing
Yep.
which one is best for you. So, thank you very much for joining us today, Peter. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And just a reminder, the book is called In Praise of the Office. Easy to find.
Yeah, I available on Amazon. I would highly encourage people to take a read of it. But yeah, no, Peter, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.